The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, Chapter 173. Between the roof of the shed and the big plant that hangs over the fence from the house next door, I could see the constellation Orion. People say that Orion is called Orion because Orion was a hunter and the constellation looks like a hunter with a club and a bow and arrow, like this. But this is really silly because it is just stars and you could join up the dots in any way you wanted, and you could make it look like a lady with an umbrella who is waving, or the coffee maker, which Mrs. Shears has, which is from Italy, with a handle and steam coming out, or like a dinosaur. And there aren't any lines in space, so you could join bits of Orion to bits of Lepus or Taurus or Gemini and say that they were a constellation called the Bunch of Grapes, or Jesus, or the Bicycle, except that they didn't have bicycles in Roman and Greek times, which was when they called Orion, Orion. And anyway, Orion is not a hunter or a coffee maker or a dinosaur. It is just a bunch of stars that I don't know the names of, and they are nuclear explosions billions of miles away. And that is the truth. Chapter 179. I stayed awake until 3:47. That was the last time I looked at my watch before I fell asleep. It had a luminous face and lights up if you press a button, so I could read it in the dark. I was cold and I was frightened. Father might come out and find me, but I felt safer in the garden because I was hidden. I looked at the sky a lot. I like looking up at the sky in the garden at night. In summer, I sometimes come outside at night with my torch and my planisphere, which is 2 circles of plastic with a pin through the middle. And on the bottom is a map of the sky, and on the top is an aperture, which is an opening shaped in a parabola, and you turn it round to see a map of the sky that you can see on that day of the year from the latitude 51.5 degrees north, which is the latitude that Swindon is on, because the largest bit of the sky is always on the other side of the Earth. And when you look at the sky, you know you are looking at stars which are hundreds and thousands of light years away from you. And some of the stars don't even exist anymore because their light has taken so long to get to us that they're already dead. Or they have exploded and collapsed into red dwarfs. And that makes you seem very small. And if you have difficult things in your life, it is nice to think that they are what is called negligible. Which means that they are so small you don't have to take them into account when you are calculating something. I didn't sleep very well because of the cold and because the ground was very bumpy and pointy underneath me, and because Toby was scratching in his cage a lot. But when I woke up properly, it was dawn and the sky was all orange and blue and purple, and I could hear birds singing, which is called the dawn chorus, and I stayed where I was for another 2 hours and 32 minutes. And then I heard Father come into the garden and call out, "Christopher! Christopher!" So I turned round and I found an old plastic sack covered in mud that used to have fertiliser in it, and I squeezed myself and Toby's cage and my special food box into the corner between the wall of the shed and the fence and the rainwater tub, and I covered myself with the fertiliser sack. And then I heard Father coming down the garden, and I took my Swiss Army knife out of my pocket and got out the saw blade and held it in case he found us. And I heard him open the door of the shed and look inside. And then I heard his footsteps in the bushes round the side of the shed, and my heart was beating really fast. And I could feel the feeling like a balloon inside my chest again. And I think he might have looked around the back of the shed, but I couldn't see because I was hiding. But he didn't see me because I heard him walking back up the garden again. Then I stayed still, and I looked at my watch, and I stayed still for 27 minutes. And then I heard Father start the engine of his van. I knew it was his van because I'd heard it very often, and it was nearby, and I knew it wasn't any of the neighbours' cars because the people who have a Volkswagen camper van, and Mr. Thompson, who lives at number 40, has a Vauxhall Cavalier. And the people who live at number 34 have a Peugeot, and they all sound different. And when I heard him drive away from the house, I knew it would be safe to come out. And then I had to decide what to do because I couldn't live in the house with Father anymore because it was dangerous. So I made a decision. I decided that I would go and knock on Mrs. Shears' door and I would go and live with her because I knew her and she wasn't a stranger and I had stayed in her house before when there was a power cut on our side of the street. And this time she wouldn't tell me to go away because I would be able to tell her who had killed Wellington, and that way she would know that I was a friend. And also she would understand why I couldn't live with Father anymore. I took the licorice laces and the pink wafer biscuit and the last clementine out of my special food box and put them in my pocket and hid the special food box under the fertiliser bag. Then I picked up Toby's cage and my extra coat and I climbed out from behind the shed. I walked up the garden and down the side of the house. I undid the bolt in the garden door and walked out in front of the house. There was no one in the street, so I crossed and walked up the drive to Mrs. Shears' house. I knocked on the door and waited and worked out what I was going to say when she opened the door. But she didn't come to the door, so I knocked again. Then I turned round and saw some people walking down the street, and I was frightened again because it was two of the people from the house next door. So I grabbed Toby's cage and went round the side of Mrs. Shear's house and sat down behind the dustbin so that they couldn't see me. And then I had to work out what to do. And I did this by thinking of all the things I could do and deciding whether they were the right decision or not. I decided that I couldn't go home again. And I decided that I couldn't go and live with Siobhan because she couldn't look after me when school was closed because she was a teacher and not a friend or a member of the family. And I decided that I couldn't go and live with Uncle Terry because he lived in Sunderland and I didn't know how to get to Sunderland, and I didn't like Uncle Terry because he smoked cigarettes and stroked my hair. And I decided I couldn't go and live with Mrs. Alexander because she wasn't a friend or a member of my family, even if she had a dog, because I couldn't stay overnight in her house or use her toilet because she had used it and she was a stranger. And then I thought I could go live with Mother because she was my family and I knew where she lived because I remembered the address from the letters, which was 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG. Except that she lived in London and I'd never been to London before. I'd only been to Dover to go to France and to Sunderland to visit Uncle Terry and to Manchester to visit Aunt Ruth, who had cancer, except she didn't have cancer when I was there. And I'd never been anywhere apart from the shop at the end of the road on my own. And the thought of going somewhere on my own was frightening. But then I thought about going home again, or staying where I was, or hiding in the garden every night and Father finding me, and that made me feel even more frightened. And when I thought about it like that, I thought I was going to be sick again, like I did the night before. And then I realised there was nothing I could do which felt safe, and I made a picture of it in my head. And then I imagined crossing out all the possibilities which were impossible, which is like in a maths exam. When you look at all the questions and you decide which ones you're going to do and which ones you're not going to do, and you cross out the ones which you're not going to do because then your decision is final and you can't change your mind. Which meant that I had to go to London and live with Mother, and I could do it by going on a train because I knew all about trains from the train set. How you looked at the timetable and went to the station and bought a ticket and looked at the departure board to see if your train was on time, and then you went to the right platform and got on board. And I would go from Swindon Station, where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stop for lunch when they're on their way to Ross from Paddington in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. And then I looked at the wall on the opposite side of the little passage down the side of Mrs. Shear's house, where I was sitting, and there was a circular lid of a very old metal pan leaning against the wall, and it was covered in rust, and it looked like the surface of a planet because the rust was shaped like countries and continents and islands. And then I thought about how I could never be an astronaut, because being an astronaut meant being hundreds of thousands of miles away from home, and my home was in London now, and that was about 100 miles away, which was more than 1,000 times nearer than my home would be if I was in space. And thinking about this made me hurt, like when I fell over at the grass at the edge of a playground once, and I cut my knee on a piece of broken bottle that someone had thrown over the wall, and I sliced a flap of skin off, and Mr. Davis had to clean the flesh under the flap with disinfectant to get the germs and the dirt out, and it hurt so much that I cried. But this hurt was inside my head, and it made me sad to think that I could never become an astronaut. And then I thought I had to be like Sherlock Holmes, and I had to detach my mind at will to a remarkable degree, so that I did not notice how much I was hurting inside my head. And then I thought I would need money if I was going to go to London, and I would need food to eat because it was a long journey, and I wouldn't know where to get food from. And then I thought I would need someone to look after Toby when I went to London, because I couldn't take him with me. And then I formulated a plan, and that made me feel better, because there was something in my head that had an order and a pattern, and I just had to follow the instructions one after the other. I stood up and made sure there was no one in the street. Then I went to Mrs. Alexander's house, which is next door to Mrs. Shear's house, and I knocked on the door. Then Mrs. Shears opened the door and she said, "Christopher, what on earth has happened to you?" And I said, "Can you look after Toby for me?" She said, "Who's Toby?" And I said, "Toby's my pet rat." And then Mrs. Alexander said, Oh, yes, I remember him now. You told me." Then I held up Toby's cage and I said, "This is him." Mrs. Alexander took a step backwards into her hallway, and I said, "He eats special pellets and you can buy them from a pet shop, but he can also eat biscuits and carrots and bread and chicken bones. But you mustn't give him chocolate because it's got caffeine in, which is poisonous for rats in large quantities. And he needs a new water in his bottle every day too. And he won't mind being in someone else's house because he's an animal, and he likes to come out of his cage, but it doesn't matter if you don't take him out." Then Mrs. Alexander said, "Why do you need someone to look after Toby, Christopher?" And I said, "I'm going to London." She said, "How long are you going for?" And I said, "Until I go to university." And she said, "Can't you take Toby with you?" And I said, "London's a long way away, and I don't want to take him to the train because I might lose him." Mrs. Alexander said, "Right." And then she said, "Are you and your father moving house?" "No." And she said, "Why are you going to London?" And I said, "I'm going to live with Mother." And she said, I thought you told me your mother was dead. And I said, I thought she was dead, but she was still alive. And Father lied to me, and also he said he killed Wellington. And Mrs. Alexander said, oh my goodness. And I said, I'm going to live with my mother because Father killed Wellington and he lied, and I'm frightened of being in the house with him. Mrs. Alexander said, is your mother here? And I said, no, mother is in London. And she said, so you're going to London on your own? And I said, yes. And she said, look, Christopher, why don't you come inside and sit down? We can talk about this and work out what is the best thing to do. I said, no, I can't come inside. Will you look after Toby for me? And she said, I really don't think that would be a good idea, Christopher. And I didn't say anything. And she said, where's your father at the moment, Christopher? And I said, I don't know. She said, well, perhaps we should try and give him a ring and see if we can get in touch with him. I'm sure he's worried about you, and I'm sure that there's been some dreadful misunderstanding. So I turned around and ran across the road back to our house, and didn't look before I crossed the road, and the yellow Mini had to stop, and the tyres squealed on the road, and I ran down the side of the house and back through the garden gate, and I bolted it behind me. I tried to open the kitchen door, but it was locked, so I picked up a brick that was lying in the ground, and I smashed it through the window, and the glass shattered everywhere. Then I put my arms through the broken glass, and opened the door from inside. I went into the house and put Toby down on the kitchen table. Then I ran upstairs and grabbed my school bag, and I put some food for Toby in it, and some of my maths books, and some clean pants and a vest and a clean shirt. Then I came downstairs and I opened the fridge and I put a carton of juice into my bag and a bottle of milk that hadn't been opened. And I took 2 more clementines and 2 tins of baked beans and a packet of custard creams from the cupboard and put them in my bag as well, because I could open them with the can opener on my Swiss Army knife. Then I looked down the surface next to the sink, and I saw my father's mobile phone and his wallet and his address book, and I felt my skin cold under my clothes, like Dr. Watson in The Sign of the Four, when he sees the tiny footsteps of Tonga and the Andaman Islander on the roof of Bartholomew Sholto's house in Norwood, because I thought Father had come back and he was in the house, and the pain in my head got much worse. But then I rewound the pictures in my memory and saw that his van wasn't parked outside the house, so he must have left his mobile phone and his wallet and his address book when he left the house. And I picked up his wallet and I took his bank card out because that was how I could get money, because his card has a PIN number, which is a secret code which you put into a machine at the bank to get money out. Father hadn't written it down in a safe place, which is what you meant to do. And he told me because he said I'd never forget it. And it was 3558. And I put the card into my pocket. Then I took Toby out of his cage and put him into the pocket of one of my coats, because the cage was very heavy to carry all the way to London. And then I went to the kitchen door into the garden again. I went out through the garden gate and made sure there wasn't anyone watching, and then I started walking towards the school because that was the direction I knew. When I got to school, I could ask Siobhan where the train station was. Normally, I would have got more and more frightened if I was walking to school because I'd never done it before, but I was frightened in 2 different ways. And one way was being frightened of being far away from a place I was used to, and the other was being frightened of being near where Father lived. And they were inverse proportion to one another. So that the total fear remained a constant as I got further away from home and further away from Father, like this. Fear total equals fear new place times fear near Father equals constant. It takes 19 minutes for the bus to get to school from our house, but it took me 47 minutes to walk the same distance. I was very tired when I got there, and I hoped I could stay in school for a little while and have some biscuits and some orange juice before I went to the train station. But I couldn't, because when I got to the school, I saw that Father's van was parked outside in the car park. And I knew it was his van because it said Ed Boone, heating maintenance and boiler repair on the side with a crossed spanners sign. And when I saw the van, I was sick again, but I knew I was going to be sick this time, so I didn't sick over myself, and I was just sick onto the wall and the pavement. And I wasn't very much sick because I hadn't eaten much. And when I had been sick, I wanted to curl up on the ground and do groaning, but I knew that if I curled up on the ground and did groaning, then Father would come out of school and he would see me and he would catch me and take me home. So I took lots of deep breaths, like Siobhan says I have to if someone hits me at school. And I counted 50 breaths, and I concentrated very hard on the numbers and did their cubes as I said them, and that made the hurt less painful. And then I cleaned the sick away from my mouth, and I made a decision that I would have to find out how to get to the train station. And I would do this by asking someone. And it would be a lady, because when they talk to us about stranger danger at school, they say that if a man comes up to you and talks to you, and you feel frightened, you should call out and find a lady to run to, because ladies are safer. So I got out my Swiss Army knife and I flicked out the saw blade and I held it tight in the pocket that Toby wasn't in so that I could stab someone if they grabbed hold of me. And then I saw a lady on the other side of the street with a baby in a pushchair and a little boy with a toy elephant. So I decided to ask her. And this time I looked left and right and left again so that I wouldn't be run over by a car. And I crossed the road. I said to the lady, "Where can I buy a map?" And she said, "Pardon?" I said, "Where can I buy a map?" And I could feel the hand that was holding the knife shaking, even though I wasn't shaking it. And she said, "Patrick, put that down, it's dirty." "A map of where?" And I said, "A map of here." She said, "I don't know." And she said, "Where do you want to get to?" I said, "I'm going to the train station." And she laughed and said, "You don't need a map to get to the train station." And I said, "I do, because I don't know where the train station is." She said, "You can see it from here." I said, "No, I can't. And also, I need to know where there is a cash machine." And she pointed and said, "There, that building says Signal Point on the top. There's a British Rail sign on the other end. The station's at the bottom of that. Patrick, I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, don't pick things off the pavement and stick them in your mouth." And I looked, and I could see a building with writing on the top, but it was a long way away, so it was hard to read. And I said, "Do you mean the stripy building with the horizontal windows?" And she said, "That's the one." "How do I get to that building?" And she said, "Gordon, Benny." And then she said, "Follow that bus." And she pointed to a bus that was going past. So I started to run. But buses go really fast, and I had to make sure that Toby didn't fall out of my pocket. But I managed to keep running after the bus for a long way, and I crossed 6 sides of the road before it turned down another street and I couldn't see it anymore. And then I stopped running because I was breathing really hard and my legs hurt. And I was in this street with lots of shops, and I remember being in this street when I went shopping with Mother, and there were lots of people in the street doing their shopping, but I didn't want them to touch me. So I walked to the edge of the road. I didn't like all the people being near me and all the noise because it was too much information in my head and it made me hard to think. Like they were shouting in my head, so I put my hands over my ears and groaned very quietly. And then I noticed that I could still see the train station sign that the lady had pointed at, so I kept on walking towards it. And then I couldn't see the sign anymore, and I had forgotten to remember where it was. And this was frightening because I was lost, and because I do not forget things. And normally I would make a map in my head and I would follow the map. And I would be able to cross on the map that I would be a little cross on the map that showed where I was. But there was too much interference in my head, and this made me more confused. So I stood under the green and white canvas roof outside a greengrocer's shop, where there were carrots and onions and parsnips and broccoli in boxes that had plastic furry green carpet in them, and I made a plan. I knew that the train station was somewhere near, and if something is nearby you can find it by moving in a spiral, walking clockwise and taking every right turn until you come back to a road you've already walked on, and then taking the next left and taking every right and turn and so on. And that was how I found the train station. And I concentrated really hard on following the rules and making a map of the centre of the town in my head as I walked. And that way, it was easier to ignore all the people and all the noise around me. And then I went in to the train station.